Drogo never took kindly to the idea of slow death. He was Khal of the Great Grass Sea, a warrior of the Dothraki, son of the wind and sky, and a man who rose with the dawn to claim victories. When the infection began to spread in the wake of the poisoned blade, the camp fell silent in grim anticipation, half expecting the mighty Khal to succumb to mortal frailty. But in the darkest hours, it was not resignation that guided Daenerys Targaryen's hand. It was desperation, fierce love, and a dangerous hope. Even the gods seemed to hold their breath. The witch's incantations had proven twisted and treacherous, yet Daenerys clung to the smallest chance that Drogo might be spared the final sleep. She commanded Mirri Maz Dur to try again, to conjure the healing without the vile twist, and she stood guard over Drogo's tent as thunderheads rolled across the sky. The tent glowed with candles, braziers, and the heady scent of herbs that Mirri crushed in her worn, ancient hands. Daenerys refused to blink or look away, even when the shadows on the canvas walls moved in odd and unsettling ways. Her silver-gold hair hung lank around her face. Sweat beaded her brow. She could taste the weight of fate in the air, metallic like blood. Drogo lay on a pallet, his great chest unmoving except for the shallowest inhalations, glimmering with sweat from the fever that threatened to drag him into the underworld. Inside that tent, during an hour that seemed to last a lifetime, Daenerys held his hand. She felt the deep grooves of calluses hardened by countless battles, the strong lines of his palm that had once caressed her cheek. Over and over, she whispered his name. Over and over, she prayed to every god she had ever heard of, every ancestor that lingered in her imagination. And then, in the hush of the final chant, she saw his eyes flutter open. A rattling breath escaped him. His gaze, once full of unstoppable fierceness, was a pale reflection of itself, but it was there. He was still alive. His fingers twitched, barely able to curl around her smaller hand, but she felt him respond. She called his name, and Mirri Maz Dur ceased her chanting, eyes hollow and dark with dread. Daenerys cared nothing for the witch's expression, though fear prickled down her spine at the strange hush in the air. Drogo had awakened, and that was enough. In the days and nights that followed, he began to heal. His enormous frame did not falter. Though his strength was slow to return, it returned all the same. At first, his khalasar had whispered among themselves. Some believed dark magic had stolen his soul, leaving behind only a husk. Others believed Daenerys was chosen by some foreign god to lead them. But as Drogo emerged from the tent on the morning of the 8th day, sunlight in his black eyes, the hush of the assembled Dothraki gave way to elation. Khal Drogo, the great rider, stood before them, and though he leaned on Daenerys, his chin was raised with pride. He took a step forward, then another. The air smelled of horses, sweat, and the dusty wind of the open plains. The assembled blood riders looked at one another with disbelief that slowly turned to exultation. Many fell to their knees, pounding their fists into the ground in rhythmic unison. That morning, the thunder of hooves erupted in the camp as the Dothraki roared in salute to their reborn Khal. Daenerys, silent tears of relief running down her cheeks, stood at Drogo's side through it all. She supported his weight, feeling the solidity of him, the life within him, and she pressed herself to his side, ignoring the flashes of pain on his face. She knew the path to full strength would be fraught, but he was alive, and that was more than she had dared hope. Days turned to weeks, weeks to a month, and Drogo's vigor rekindled like a dormant flame. He rode his silver stallion again, albeit at a slower pace, testing his muscles. At night, Daenerys would see him smother groans of pain. He would not let his khalasar witness his weakness, but the next morning he rose anew. His men told each other that death itself feared Khal Drogo, that no mortal wound could fell him. Daenerys let them sing their tales, half-lies though they might be, for she understood how legends gained their own power. Yet as Drogo regained his strength, a silent tension remained between husband and wife. The cause was obvious to both but spoken by neither. The price that had been paid for his revival, the swirl of blood magic that still hovered like a phantom in Daenerys's memory. She had not hesitated to command Mirri Maz Dur to do whatever it took. And though she had carefully prevented the witch from enacting the same treachery that had nearly driven Drogo into a living death, Daenerys could not help but wonder if there was a hidden cost somewhere, a debt owed that had not yet come due. But still, she met Drogo's eyes each day, and they saw the same future. The stallion who mounts the world would continue his journey. Then came the moment that changed everything. Drogo, newly restored, found himself gazing upon Daenerys' 3 dragon eggs, a wedding gift from Illyrio Mopatis, now in possession of a subtle warmth when touched. Perhaps it was something about Daenerys' own unusual heat, her unburnt skin, or the fervor of the Dothraki camp, but a faint crack had begun to appear on the surface of the green and bronze shell. He did not fully understand what power these eggs contained, but he sensed his wife's conviction that they were precious beyond measure. Daenerys had begun to dream of dragons stirring in the night, and the notion of returning to Westeros, once just an ember of longing, began to burn brighter. Drogo observed his Khaleesi with a certain pride and curiosity. She was no longer the timid girl he had first claimed. She had become a fierce presence, as comfortable in the saddle as any blood rider, her voice carrying authority that not even the proudest warriors could dismiss. He had promised her a golden crown in distant Westeros, a rightful throne she believed was hers by birth. Once, that promise had been but a ploy to motivate the men, to take the riches of the 7 kingdoms. Now it became a matter of personal honor. Drogo had cheated death, and in so doing, he knew his destiny lay beyond the Dothraki Sea. The stallion must ride west, and the moment of crossing would come soon. But first, the Khalasar needed unity. Rumors had circulated that Drogo's near death had made him weak in the eyes of potential challengers. Dothraki law was clear. A Khal who could not command his own must forfeit them. Rival Khals waited like carrion crows, especially those who had deserted when Drogo was bedridden and unresponsive. Drogo would not leave such threats behind, and so they rode. Like a shifting tide of hooves, Drogo's Khalasar crossed endless swaths of tall grass, the plains whispering in the constant wind. Warriors formed outriding parties to track the paths of the deserters. They found them camping near a shallow river, their numbers smaller than Drogo's but not inconsiderable. Daenerys rode with Drogo as they approached. She was dressed in leathers and vest cloth typical of the Dothraki, her silver hair braided in the style of a Khaleesi who had known victory. At her hip hung a curved blade, a gift from one of Drogo's most loyal blood riders, Qotho, as a sign of respect. When the deserters saw the standard of the horse's tail rising in the distance, Drogo's banner, they mounted up, anticipating either parley or battle. It was the latter. Drogo did not slow his charge, nor did he send an emissary. This was a matter of vengeance and power. He would not have to speak to men who had turned their backs on him. The thunder of hooves shook the earth, and Daenerys felt the familiar adrenaline spike in her veins. Her own mount surged forward, but Drogo was already pushing ahead. Their call, reborn, clashed with the first group of warriors in a violent swirl of horses, dust, and steel rocks. Drogo's arak sang in the air. His mighty stallion crashed into the lines of deserters. In those moments, Daenerys saw him as he had been at the height of his power, unstoppable, fluid in motion, cutting men from the saddle with fearsome grace. Blood streaked across Drogo's chest, not his own, and he roared to the sky. The Khalasar behind him descended upon the deserters. Daenerys herself fought carefully, remembering her training with the arak that Jorah Mormont and the Blood Riders had given her. She was no unstoppable force like Drogo, but she knew how to position herself, to keep her horse moving, to use the curved blade to slash at an unprotected flank. Her heart hammered, but she felt a dangerous exhilaration in the fight. When the final deserter fell, the survivors, perhaps a handful, threw down their weapons and prostrated themselves before Drogo's feet, begging forgiveness. The Khal might have laughed at their weakness. Instead, he gestured to Qotho. The Blood Rider understood. The survivors' throats were cut as an offering to the great stallion. No traitor would be brought back to camp. That night, around the fires, they feasted on horse meat and strong drink. The men told the tale of Drogo's return to the saddle and his swift revenge. Daenerys watched the shadows flicker across her husband's face. He looked weary, more than he would admit. Once or twice, he shifted in his seat, a faint wince betraying some lingering pain in his side. But the call was triumphant, and no one dared speak of any sign of weakness. As the embers died, Daenerys slipped a hand around his forearm, helping him to his feet. His eyes met hers in a silent exchange, gratitude and love. In the weeks that followed, the Khalasar's size grew as men who had once strayed came back for fear or awe of Khal Drogo's legend. Whispers spread across the Dothraki Sea that this Khal had looked death in the eye and refused to bow. Others came, too, travelers from lands beyond V's Dothrak, exiles and would-be sellswords from the free cities, each hoping to attach themselves to the might of this unstoppable horde. As Drogo gathered his strength and men, Daenerys tended to her growing certainty that the dragon eggs were no mere curiosities. One night, she dared to place them near the hottest coals of the central fire pit in her tent. The eggs grew warmer, responding to the heat. The green and bronze egg trembled faintly beneath her palm. She stayed awake until the moon sank beyond the horizon, observing each ripple in its shell. Though no hatchling emerged, she felt new life stirring within. When Drogo saw her preoccupation, he demanded to know if she believed the eggs could truly hatch. Daenerys spoke of ancient Targaryen lore, half-remembered from stories Viserys had once told her, or from old records in Illyrio's manse. She admitted she was not certain. He gave a short grunt of acknowledgement. "They belong to you," he said in the common tongue, halting but determined. "You are blood of the dragon. If they wake, it is your doing." And so, little by little, a plan began to form between them. If Daenerys could indeed bring dragons back into the world, and Drogo commanded the mightiest Khalasar in living memory, then crossing the narrow sea would not just be a dream. It would be a conquest that might shake the very foundations of Westeros. The notion lit a spark in Drogo's eyes. He remembered the promise he had made to his Khaleesi, the vow to take back the Iron Throne that was her birthright, to see her crowned as Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. Now it seemed more than an idle boast. Still, crossing the sea was an entirely different matter. The Dothraki dreaded open water, calling it the poison water that no horse could drink. Drogo had always viewed it with contempt. But for the promise he had made, for the chance at unimaginable spoils and to see Daenerys rightfully enthroned, he would do what no Khal had done in centuries: command his riders to board ships and face the unknown waves. Many of his warriors would balk, but he was confident that his reputation and the promise of dragons would keep most of them in line. The great stallion had chosen him to mount the world, after all. And if the whispers about Daenerys's eggs proved true, how could any man doubt their destiny? Their path took them eastward, toward the great city of Qarth. Drogo was intent on building alliances or purchasing enough ships to ferry the Khalasar across the narrow sea. The route would be long, the journey arduous, but Qarth was said to be home to merchants and traders from all corners of the known world. If ships could be found anywhere, it was there. Also, Daenerys believed that in Qarth, she might find knowledge about the hatching of dragons, for the city prized arcane knowledge and boasted many warlocks and sorcerers. They rode through the Red Waste, an unforgiving desert of scorching heat and no shade save for sparse thorny shrubs. The Dothraki dreaded it less than the sea, but it was a far cry from the grassy plains that sustained their horses. Water was scarce, and a good portion of the Khalasar's time was spent hunting for hidden oases or trading with small desert tribes. And yet, throughout the hardships, Drogo's presence remained a steadfast anchor. Whenever men or women fretted, uncertain whether the journey was wise, Drogo reminded them of the wealth, glory, and fear that would belong to them once they conquered Westeros. Daenerys, for her part, added the promise of dragons. Though still only eggs, her conviction struck many of the Dothraki with awe or at least a cautious reverence. So they pressed on. Day by day, Daenerys suspected the eggs were growing warmer. Often, she carried them wrapped in cloth during the heat of the desert day. During the cooler nights, she kept them near a fire. She remembered the words of old tales, fire and blood, the words of House Targaryen. The hotter the world around the eggs became, the more active they seemed. She began to see hairline cracks, luminous and thin, like spider silk lines in stone. When at last they reached the outskirts of Qarth, the city rose before them like a vision of shimmering walls and ornate gates. Tall spires etched against a brutally blue sky. The gates were flung open to travelers, but the Qartheen were known to be as proud as they were wealthy. The sight of a massive Dothraki horde approaching set the city's defenders on edge. The immortal guard manned the walls, long spears gleaming. Even so, Qarth prided itself on hospitality, especially to those with riches to spend. Drogo allowed Ser Jorah Mormont to negotiate on his behalf for a camp outside the walls, not trusting the Qartheen's famed courtesy. Meanwhile, Daenerys was invited into the city by an emissary of the Pureborn, the ruling elite of Qarth, who were curious to see this mother of dragons and her powerful husband. She entered the city with a modest retinue, Jorah, a few blood riders and handmaidens. Within the city, Daenerys found grand palaces with doorways made of hammered gold, broad avenues lined with statues of exotic beasts, and people dressed in flowing robes of sheer fabrics. The air smelled of cinnamon, saffron, and the pungent spices of the Far East. Qarth was a place of illusions and half-truths. She had been warned, and she felt it keenly in every too-bright smile that greeted her. Xaro Zoan Daxos, a charismatic merchant prince, took a keen interest in Daenerys upon hearing rumors of her dragon eggs. He insisted on hosting a lavish feast in her honor. Daenerys, knowing the importance of making alliances in this city, accepted. The night of the feast, she arrived clad in a gown of light silver cloth that bared her shoulders, accentuating her platinum hair braided with silver bells. At her belt, she wore a small dagger, a token of caution. Xaro's palace was an extravagant display of wealth. Columns inlaid with mother-of-pearl, fountains gurgling with perfumed water, and silken drapes that swayed in the warm breezes. Her blood riders stood watch at the corners of the hall, scanning for threats. Xaro himself greeted her with outstretched arms, a ring on each finger. His robes dyed a deep shade of lilac. He offered her perfumed wine, sweet as nectar. When the feast was at its zenith, jugglers tossing colored balls of fire, dancers with golden masks twirling to the beat of exotic drums, Xaro began his flattery in earnest. He extolled Daenerys' lineage, lamented the tragedy that befell House Targaryen, and assured her that the rightful queen would be welcomed in Qarth's port if she so desired. But he had terms. He wanted a dragon, or at least the promise of one, in exchange for a fleet of ships large enough to carry Drogo's khalasar across the sea. Daenerys met his request with a measured expression. She thought of how Viserys might have sold the eggs without a second thought if it suited him. But these eggs were more than mere objects. They were the living heart of her future. She sipped her wine. She could not simply hand them over, not even one. She told Xaro as much, gently but firmly. If she truly hatched them, they would be her children, in a sense, not chattel to be bargained away. Xaro feigned disappointment but flashed a knowing smile, as if the game were only beginning. Nonetheless, negotiations continued over the following days. Daenerys visited various merchants, warlocks, and learned men, gleaning bits of knowledge about dragons, how they might be awakened from stone. Most seemed too eager to peddle false charms or worthless tomes, but a few words stuck out, repeated in hushed tones. Only death pays for life. She recalled how Mirri Maz Duur's magic had seemed to revolve around that exact principle. The memory made her skin crawl, and she resolved to be very careful in trying to hatch the eggs. She refused to bring any more bloodshed for the sake of a ritual. While Daenerys navigated the labyrinth of Qartheen politics, Drogo remained encamped outside the walls, chafing at the city's posturing. He trained daily with his blood riders, pushed the khalasar to maintain discipline. The Dothraki gazed with curiosity at the city's splendor, but they trusted Drogo's caution. Qarth was no place for thousands of mounted warriors to roam free. Ser Jorah did his part to keep the uneasy peace between the city's guards and the restless Dothraki. At length, Xaro came forward with a proposition. He would arrange a gathering of the Pureborn at which Daenerys and Drogo could formally present their request for a fleet. In return, Xaro wanted the promise of future trade monopolies once Daenerys took the Iron Throne. Daenerys, though wary, agreed that this seemed a more favorable approach than bartering away a dragon. A meeting was arranged in one of the greatest halls of Qarth, an open courtyard with pillars carved in the shapes of twisting serpents, a marble floor laid out in a mosaic of the known world. The pureborn, each draped in robes of immaculate white, sat in a semicircle to receive their guests. Daenerys entered with Drogo at her side, stepping into the hush of the courtyard. Where Daenerys carried herself with poised grace, Drogo stood like a storm made flesh, wearing leather and furs, and a rack strapped to his belt. His eyes flickered with the challenge of meeting so many pompous individuals in one place. The pureborn asked for a formal introduction, so Daenerys announced herself with all the titles she had come to claim. Daenerys Stormborn of the House Targaryen, Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, the Unburnt, Mother of Dragons. Her voice carried, echoing off the pillars. Drogo listened with pride but did not speak. Then, in the common tongue, she described their desire to cross the narrow sea, reclaim the Seven Kingdoms, and offered Qarth favorable trade agreements on spices, silk, routes, precious metals, once she wore the crown. Drogo cut a striking figure during her speech, though he said little. The pureborn exchanged glances. One of them, an older woman with bracelets up her arms, inquired politely after proof of the dragons, for rumors had spread. Daenerys produced one egg, carefully cradled in a padded box. The crowd stirred. Eyes glittered greedily at the sight of the shimmering shell. She emphasized that the dragons were not yet hatched but assured them it was only a matter of time. Silence fell. The pureborn were not fools. They understood that if Daenerys truly hatched dragons, she would hold a terrifying power. They also knew that backing a Targaryen restoration might provoke the wrath of other factions or even the free cities that profited from the current status quo in Westeros. After a tense pause, the elder who spoke for the pureborn stated that they would discuss the matter privately and give their verdict the next day. Daenerys and Drogo had little choice but to nod in acceptance. That night, they left the city with the Qartheen Guard's formal escort, returning to their encampment. Daenerys felt the weight of the moment. Drogo, once they were alone in their pavilion, let out a snarl of frustration. He had never been one for such diplomacy. He questioned whether all this groveling before city dwellers was worth it. Would it not be simpler to sack Qarth and take their ships by force? Daenerys pressed a hand to his chest. "They have walls," she reminded him softly. "Walls our horses cannot breach so easily. Their immortal guard are said to be formidable. And we have too many women and children in the Khalasar. The cost in lives would be steep." He rumbled a low acknowledgement. She saw the flicker of anger in his eyes, not at her, but at the constraints of the situation. Leaning in, she murmured words of reassurance, that together they would find a way. She unbraided his hair slowly, mindful of the trophies woven into each twist, and let him rest his head against her. Outside, the night air of the desert lay thick and still, and somewhere in the darkness, a caged lion roared in a distant menagerie. Morning arrived with a messenger from the pureborn, who delivered a sealed scroll bearing their decision. Daenerys' heart pounded as she unrolled the parchment. They had refused to grant her a fleet, citing concerns about the viability of her claim and the uncertain reliability of the Dothraki horde. However, they offered a small token, a single ship, a Qartheen galley, as a gesture of friendship. It was a thinly veiled insult. Drogo was livid. A single ship meant nothing to a Khalasar of tens of thousands. Daenerys felt the sting as well, but she maintained composure. She realized that Xaro must have overestimated his influence or that the pureborn had used the hearing as a way to measure her desperation. Either way, Qarth had turned them away. That night, Xaro invited her once again to his palace, entreating her not to leave in anger. When she arrived, he pleaded with her to remain in Qarth and become his guest, or his wife, an offer he hinted at with much flair. In return, he claimed, he would provide all the ships she needed from his private fleet. Daenerys stared at him, reading the hunger in his eyes. He desired her eggs, her dragons, her legacy. She turned him down as politely as she could, telling him that while she was grateful for his hospitality, her fate lay elsewhere. She was a Khaleesi, a Targaryen, and she was not for sale. The words stung his pride. His mask of civility slipped momentarily, revealing frustration. He quickly assured her that he meant no offense, but Daenerys could feel the tension. She excused herself before the exchange soured further. That night, she returned to camp, and she and Drogo spoke in hushed tones about what to do next. The rejection stung, but there might still be another path. Westeros was across the sea, and they needed ships large enough to carry their hoard, or enough smaller ships to ferry them in multiple trips. Drogo proposed that they ride south to the ancient port city of Old Guys, or perhaps approach Volantis, the oldest and most populous free city, to see if they could secure ships there. But Daenerys was weary of the labyrinthine politics and the humiliating rejections. A quiet fury had started to bloom in her chest. She was a dragon, and she would not beg. Perhaps, she reasoned, they should simply gather enough ships by sheer force or cunning. If Qarth would not sell them willingly, perhaps smaller ports along the coast of the Jade Sea or the Summer Sea would be more susceptible to intimidation. They had a massive khalasar, after all, and enough gold and plunder from previous raids to buy or coerce lesser lords. In the following days, the khalasar broke camp with a sense of grim determination. Word had spread of the Qarthine snub, and many among the Dothraki chafed at the insult to their Khal and Khaleesi. As they moved, taking the southwestern caravan routes, Drogo's temper flared often. He was quick to punish laziness or dissent with the flat of his blade. Daenerys felt a cold wind in her heart as she realized that part of him had changed after his brush with death. He was more driven, more relentless, as if he would never again leave his fate in another's hands. They began raiding small coastal settlements under the domain of no major city-state, places with modest docks and fishing fleets. The Dothraki swept in, took what they wanted, and carried off some ships. But these ships were small, ill-maintained, and hardly sufficient to carry large numbers across the notorious storms of the Narrow Sea. One or two caravels might hold a fraction of the khalasar, but Drogo refused to leave anyone behind. Desperate to find a real solution, Daenerys ordered Ser Jorah and a few trusted men to sail ahead in one of the captured ships to Volantis. They would propose an alliance or a deal in her name, see what could be arranged. Meanwhile, Daenerys and Drogo would continue overland, guiding the khalasar slowly toward Slaver's Bay, a region infamous for its ports and trade. She loathed the idea of dealing with slavers, but it was a place where huge fleets were known to exist, and if they had to, they could take them by force. As they traveled, the desert sands transitioned to more fertile lowlands, dotted with orchards and fields. Each night, Daenerys kept her dragon's eggs close, convinced they responded to her dreams. A simmering warmth pulsed beneath their shells, as if they were on the cusp of awakening. She could almost feel their heartbeats. One evening, she and Drogo stood atop a rocky outcrop overlooking the endless line of their khalasar. Fires dotted the horizon, thousands of small flames flickering in the darkness. The calls of the Dothraki drifted through the air. Daenerys felt the press of the hot night against her skin. Drogo stepped behind her, strong arms encircling her waist. He pressed his mouth to her ear, whispering that soon they would sail for Westeros. He spoke of his desire to cross the sea, defy the old Dothraki taboos, and see the spires of the Red Keep broken beneath his stallion's hooves. She turned in his arms and looked into his dark eyes, feeling the hunger there. It was more than lust. It was ambition, vengeance, and a savage yearning to prove his might against an entire continent. Daenerys, though she shared the ambition, felt a wave of anxiety as well. Westeros would not be a land of unprotected villages. Houses Targaryen had once ruled it, but now it was full of proud lords and knights who would fight for their current king or their own interests. She remembered the tales. The Lannisters, the Starks, the Baratheons, the Tyrells, and many more. They would not simply bow to a Dothraki horde. But if the dragons hatched, if the old power of her blood truly returned, the odds would shift. Days turned to weeks, and the khalasar inched closer to the edges of Slaver's Bay. The terrain became more humid, the roads more traveled by caravans carrying slaves, exotic animals, and goods. Watchful eyes tracked the approach of the Dothraki, and many outlying settlements and plantations fled or fortified themselves at news of an oncoming horde. Daenerys felt disgust twist in her stomach as she saw slaves forced to labor under pitiless overseers. She asked Drogo if they might free some of them. Drogo answered with a shrug. Slavery was not a Dothraki custom, but it was not something they uniformly abhorred either. Some of his men had grown used to taking captives after raids, to trade them later. Seeing Daenerys' disquiet, he told her that a man who could not fight to protect himself deserved no freedom. But sensing her resolve, he did not entirely forbid her from doing as she wished with any slaves she encountered. She was his Khaleesi, after all, and if she desired to free them, that was her right. Thus, as they overran small pockets of slavers, Daenerys ordered the chains struck off some of the captives. Many of them, starved and desperate, pledged themselves to her. She gave them leave to travel with the khalasar or go free, whichever they chose. Most, having nowhere else to go, chose to stay, swelling the ranks of her followers with a motley group from many lands. They hailed her as Breaker of Chains, a title that began as a hushed murmur among the freed. Word traveled quickly through the camps, stirring rumors that this Targaryen queen sought a different path. Meanwhile, news arrived from Ser Jorah. He had reached Volantis, where he learned that many of the city's merchant princes were also wary of selling or lending their fleets to a Dothraki call. Some found the notion heretical. Others demanded exorbitant prices. The presence of Yunkai, Meereen, and Astapor further complicating alliances in Slaver's Bay meant that any attempt to purchase a large fleet would be fraught. Jorah mentioned that there were rumors of a captain in Volantis who might be willing to deal with Daenerys directly, but the man was currently in Meereen on business. Perhaps an in-person visit from Daenerys would shift the negotiation. Drogo had no patience for further negotiations. He wanted to ride directly on Meereen, seize its ships, and lay claim to them by force. Daenerys worried that an assault on a major city like Meereen would be costly. Memories of Qarth's imposing walls lingered. But the strategic advantage of Meereen was clear. It had one of the largest harbors in Slaver's Bay, and its walls might not be as formidable against a united Dothraki horde as Qarth's illusions and politics were. Moreover, internal conflicts in Meereen could be exploited, especially if they saw the might of Drogo's force at their doorstep. Still, Daenerys remained torn. Each day brought her closer to the moment when she might attempt to hatch the dragons. She wondered if it would be better to do so before any siege, to show the city the power they faced and force them to surrender. But the method to hatch them eluded her. She had tried intense heat, near scorching the eggs, but that alone was not enough. She dared not replicate the blood magic Mirri Maz Dur had used, not knowing if it would corrupt the process or if it might end in tragedy. And yet, she felt sure that only the most extreme flame, touched by life and death, could birth dragons. Her nightmares and dreams blended, swirling with images of fire consuming entire worlds, from which emerged winged shapes. Eventually, the khalasar took the road toward Meereen. The city, perched on the northern coast of Slaver's Bay, loomed with its massive pyramids and labyrinthine streets. Word of the approaching Dothraki was carried by fleeing merchants and travelers. By the time Drogo's outriders reached sight of the city, its gates were closed, and the walls bristled with defenders. The banners of various Meereenese noble houses hung limply in the hot, dusty air. The khalasar set up an encampment several leagues from the main gate. Scouts rode close, surveying the fortifications. Meereen was guarded by harpy statues perched on its walls, an ancient symbol of the city's pride and cruelty. The harpies' wings spread wide, overshadowing the slavers who had grown fat on the trade of human flesh. Drogo snarled at the sight. Daenerys stared at the distant walls, wondering what horrors lay within. This was a city infamous for its fighting pits, its display of crucified slaves along the roads. In the first few days, Drogo's men raided outlying villages and farmland, driving in survivors as warnings to Meereen that the Dothraki had come. Araks dripped with blood. Columns of smoke drifted across the horizon. Daenerys kept her counsel, knowing that the demonstration of might bring the city to negotiate. But each new wave of terrified refugees who arrived at the gates pricked her conscience. She was Targaryen, yes, but she had sworn to protect those who could not protect themselves. On the 5th day of the siege, an emissary from Meereen approached under a flag of truce. He was a lean, sharp-eyed man wearing a rich tunic. He addressed Daenerys and Drogo with flowery courtesy, inquiring about what they sought. Drogo's voice rumbled like distant thunder as he declared that he wanted every ship in Meereen's harbor, no exceptions, and enough provisions to cross the sea. In exchange, he offered not to burn the city to ash. The emissary swallowed nervously, glancing at Daenerys. She added that if Meereen complied, she would prohibit the Khalasar from slaughtering innocents inside the walls or raising the city's famed pyramids. The emissary, trembling, left with their demands. A day later, he returned, carefully announcing that the great masters of Meereen would consider ceding some of their fleet if the demands were lowered and an accord was reached for future trade. Drogo spat on the ground, unimpressed. The tension thickened. It was clear that the city was testing how far they could push. Meanwhile, Ser Jorah arrived with the rumored captain he had found, a man named Orain Waters, who claimed to be an exiled noble from Westeros with knowledge of seafaring. Whether that was true or not, the man had command of a small but serviceable squadron of ships anchored in Meereen's harbor. He was willing to do business, but at a high price, and he insisted on verifying that Daenerys truly intended to invade Westeros. Orain displayed the cunning politeness of a sell-sale. He wanted a stake in the spoils of war, perhaps a seat of power once the conquest was done. Drogo disliked the man on sight, sensing a weasel's craftiness in his smooth words. Daenerys remained polite but non-committal. She realized she had options. Either they forced Meereen to yield its entire fleet, or they struck a deal with Orain for enough ships to get started. The second option might be safer, if the city would not capitulate without a bloody siege. But Drogo believed a siege would be over quickly, that the Dothraki's terror would break the city. That night, Daenerys walked among the tents, listening to the chatter in the camp. Warriors polished their araks, boasted of how they would ride through the streets of Meereen. Freedmen and freedwomen from earlier raids huddled in groups, uncertain whether they had exchanged one tyranny for another. Daenerys felt their eyes on her, hopeful yet anxious. She thought of the dragon eggs resting in her pavilion, heard their faint crackling under her fingertips. Only death pays for life. As she stepped inside, she found Drogo pacing, tense with the weight, their gazes locked. He approached her, sweeping aside a table in frustration. "Tomorrow," he said in a low voice, "I will send a final threat. If they do not open their gates, we will take the city by force. They will drown in their own blood." Daenerys placed a hand on his chest. "I understand," she answered, "but I must do something first. I must try to hatch the eggs." Drogo frowned, glancing at the precious ovals resting in a brazier near the fire. "What do you need?" She hesitated. The memory of Mirri Maz Duur's ritual rose unbidden in her mind. She shook it off, pressing a hand to her temple. Heat and flame, and maybe my own willingness to sacrifice. His eyes narrowed. "No more blood magic," he warned, voice rumbling with the threat of old memories. She swallowed. "I promise, no more black magic. But they will not hatch with a simple candle. They need a great fire, I think. A great conflagration." Drogo studied her for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "At dawn," he said, "we will build the largest pyre you desire. But after that, if the eggs do not wake, I will take this city." That was the pact. Daenerys spent the remainder of the night preparing for what might be her final gamble. She selected an open space near the camp's edge, where the wind would not carry sparks into the tents. Workers gathered immense piles of wood, oil-soaked brush, anything that would burn hot and bright. The nights around Slaver's Bay were still warm, but she did not trust the dryness alone. She wanted an inferno. At first light, a hush fell across the camp as Dothraki, freedmen, and all manner of folk gathered in a ring. The rising sun painted the sky in streaks of red and gold, a fitting backdrop for a scene that felt both sacred and perilous. Drogo stood at Daenerys' side, arms folded, hair braided with countless bells. Ser Jorah lingered close, hand on his sword hilt, uncertain. The 3 eggs, black and scarlet, cream and gold, green and bronze, were arranged at the center of the pyre, carefully placed by Daenerys herself. She felt them radiating warmth, like beating hearts, though whether it was her imagination or something more, she could not say. The wood rose as high as a small hill. The hush deepened. Daenerys stepped forward, her silver hair glinting in the dawn. She wore a simple white robe, unadorned by jewels or ornaments, as if she prepared for a solemn rite. Drogo handed her a torch. She looked up into his dark eyes. He nodded once. Slowly, she turned and plunged the torch into the oil-soaked timbers. Flames leaped up with a crackling roar. She circled the pyre, lighting it from 4 sides until the entire structure was engulfed in flames that danced higher and higher. The crackle turned into a deep roar, heat billowing outward like a living beast. Many in the crowd instinctively stepped back, shielding their eyes. Daenerys did not. She stared into the blaze, feeling the pulsing in her veins. She remembered the moment she had walked into the flames of Drogo's funeral pyre in another life, except that life had changed when she saved him from death. Now, she faced a second crucible, not of mourning but of defiance, a forging of her future. She lowered her head. A memory of the old words whispered in her mind. Only death pays for life. She breathed slowly, then stepped closer to the edge of the blaze. She could feel the scorching heat against her skin, the dryness in her throat. The crowd gasped. Drogo's hands curled into fists at his side, but he did not call her back. His faith in her was as strong as his will. Cautiously, Daenerys moved into the flames, letting the hunger of the fire lick at the hem of her robe. She winced. Unlike the previous time, she had no illusions about what might happen if the dragons did not protect her. But she was the unburnt, was she not? She closed her eyes, letting the fire wash over her. For a terrifying moment, she felt the raw agony of heat searing her skin. Then something within her awoke, a potent, ancient power that surged through her blood. The pain receded, replaced by a relentless surge of adrenaline and exultation. She reached the center, where the 3 eggs shimmered in the heart of the blaze. Rip. Pleas of shimmering air distorted her vision. With trembling hands, she placed her palms on the eggs. They were unbearably hot, yet they did not scorch her. Tiny spiderweb cracks spread across each shell. A shrill, keening sound seemed to fill her ears, or perhaps it was the roar of the pyre. For an instant, she felt as though the world was holding its breath. Then the shells split. The topmost fragments fell away, revealing small, scaly creatures squirming within. Each hatchling spread wet, leathery wings that glistened with fresh birth. Smoke curled from their nostrils. Daenerys exhaled a sob of wonder. She knelt amid the inferno, gathering the infant dragons to her. They were no bigger than cats, but they bore themselves with a primal ferocity. One screeched and shot forth a tiny jet of flame that danced in the superheated air. Outside the flames, the watchers stared, transfixed by the figure of Daenerys Targaryen, surrounded by swirling fire and smoke, naked as the robe had burned away, and scathed, holding 3 living dragons. Gasps of awe and dread rippled through the onlookers. Some fell to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the ground. Others stood rooted in shock. Drogo watched with mouth slightly agape, remembering how she had once claimed she was the blood of the dragon. Now he saw it with his own eyes. When Daenerys rose, the flames began to subside, turning into glowing embers. She emerged from the pyre, ash swirling around her, the 3 dragons clinging to her shoulders and arms with needle-sharp claws. Their eyes gleamed, one green, one black, one cream. Daenerys's hair was mostly singed away, as it had been in another timeline, but her skin was unblemished, draped in a sheen of soot and sweat. She looked like a goddess of the new world, born of fire. Drogo approached in stunned reverence, removing his cloak. He draped it carefully around her, mindful of the small reptiles perched on her. The hatchlings hissed, but Daenerys murmured softly, stroking their scaled backs, and they settled. Drogo's eyes flicked between her and the dragons. For a long moment, words failed him. Then he lowered his head, pressing his brow to hers. He recognized that she had done something no one else in the world had. She had brought the dragons back from extinction, fulfilling an ancient Targaryen prophecy. Ser Jorah was the first to kneel, followed by the Dothraki in waves. Cries of "blood of my blood" erupted, mingling with new chants. Mother of dragons! Daenerys stood with quiet dignity, leaning on Drogo for support, but radiating a power none could deny. With the dawn's light shimmering behind her, Daenerys lifted her gaze to the walls of Meereen in the distance. She felt certain that even from that far away, the watchers on the battlements had seen the fiery spectacle. A fierce determination coursed through her. She was queen to these people, and she would be queen to the Seven Kingdoms. Fire had birthed her children. Fire would see her across the sea. The next day, a hush lay over the battlefield. White smoke coiled from the embers of the massive pyre. The entire Khalasar seemed subdued, shaken by the miracle they had witnessed. The dragons had drawn the eyes of the curious and the fearful alike. Some approached timidly, wanting a closer look, only to recoil at the hiss and crackle of tiny flames. Drogo's blood riders whispered among themselves that this changed everything. Meereen's great masters must have shared that sentiment, for by midday, another emissary arrived under heavy guard. This time, there was no arrogance, no posturing. He bowed deeply to Daenerys and addressed Drogo with utmost respect. Word of the dragon hatching had spread through the city, and rumors claimed Daenerys was some sort of living goddess. The great masters, fearful of this new power, were prepared to offer a great share of their ships, perhaps all, so long as the city itself remained intact and they retained some measure of authority. Drogo heard this and laughed, his voice booming. He declared that if they gave him the entire fleet and enough gold and supplies to cross the sea, he would spare them from the worst of the Dothraki wrath. Meereen's aristocracy could remain, so long as they swore fealty to the Dragon Queen. The emissary hesitated, but after a glimpse of the dragons perched around Daenerys' tent, each one no bigger than a small hound but nonetheless terrifying, he bowed again, saying he would carry the call's words to the great masters immediately. Within hours, an agreement was reached, more a surrender than a negotiation. Meereen opened its gates under the condition that the Dothraki would not sack the city. The great masters reluctantly guided Drogo, Daenerys, and a contingent of warriors on a tour of the harbor, showcasing dozens upon dozens of ships. War galleys, trading vessels, sleek corsairs. Daenerys was no expert in naval matters, but Ser Jorah and the exiled Westerosi captain, Orain, assured her that these ships would be enough to carry the Khalasar across the narrow sea, though multiple trips might be necessary. Drogo eyed the vessels, satisfied. The next step was ensuring the cooperation of Meereen's soldiers and dockworkers in manning the ships. Drogo snarled that he would kill them all if they refused, but Daenerys took a more measured approach. She demanded the great masters order the city's men to row or sail the ships under the Dothraki's oversight. As a sign of good faith, she declared that the city's slaves be given the choice to join her new army or remain as free citizens under the city's new laws. This roused immediate fury among the great masters, but the presence of the dragons and Drogo's menacing glare quelled most protests. One of the great masters, a pale man with rings on every finger, dared to object, saying that freeing slaves would destroy their society, that the city's entire economy hinged on slave labor. In response, Drogo's arak slashed the air with deadly grace. The man's head tumbled to the ground before he could finish his protest. The rest fell silent. Daenerys did not stop Drogo. She knew that to show weakness now might unravel everything. Instead, she stood over the body, forcing herself not to flinch. She had to be strong, for her children, for her Khalasar, for the slaves who deserved freedom. Within days, the city had changed drastically. Slaves were unshackled, trembling as they stepped into the uncertain reality of freedom. Some cried out in gratitude to Daenerys, while others feared what would come next. The great masters, stripped of their absolute power, brooded in their manners. Daenerys, as she walked the streets, saw the remains of crucified slaves along the walls. She ordered them taken down and given proper burials. Drogo oversaw the great masters as they broke the chains themselves, ensuring a symbolic reversal of roles. Many Dothraki found this deeply amusing, though some muttered that the Khaleesi's mercy was too lenient. During this transition, the dragons remained a source of both awe and terror. They grew rapidly, devouring meat by the pound, their squeals and roars echoing through the city's stone corridors. Some nights, Daenerys awoke to find them squabbling among themselves, snapping jaws at each other. She soothed them with soft words in High Valyrian, forging a bond that felt as primal as the flames they breathed. Amid the flurry of activity, Drogo and Daenerys planned the invasion of Westeros. The fleet would need time to be properly staffed and outfitted. Meereen's dockworkers labored under constant supervision, fitting supplies for the long journey across the summer sea, around Valyria's smoking ruins, and eventually north to the narrow sea. It would not be a short voyage. Daenerys proposed traveling west through Slaver's Bay, around Sithorios, but Ser Jorah cautioned that the waters beyond Valyria's peninsula were haunted by storms and unnatural dangers. The safer route might be to sail up the coast toward Volantis, then Lys, Myr, and eventually toward the Stepstones near Dorne. But no matter the route, it would be an epic crossing. Some in the Khalasar balked at the notion of setting foot on ships. Dothraki tradition held that any water a horse could not drink was cursed. But the presence of the dragons, and Drogo's unyielding will, quelled most dissent. Drogo had proven himself unstoppable. The men believed in him, or at least they feared him and the dragons enough to obey. One evening, as Daenerys stood atop the highest pyramid in Meereen, looking out over the harbor filled with ships bearing new Targaryen standards that flapped in the breeze, she felt a surge of anticipation. So much had happened since the day she prayed over Drogo's deathbed. She glanced at the dragons perched on the parapets near her. Drogon, Rhaegal, Viserion. They were still young, yet each day they grew, feeding on goats or oxen. Soon, they would be large enough to carry her on their backs, or so she believed. Drogo joined her at the parapet, resting a broad hand on her shoulder. The city lights glimmered below like scattered embers. His expression was pensive. "This is only the beginning," he said, his Dothraki accent coloring the common tongue. She nodded, pressing her face into his chest, inhaling the scent of leather and spice. In the following weeks, under the threat of Dothraki retaliation, the city's shipwrights and captains prepared the fleet. At last, the day came when the first wave of ships would depart. Drogo, Daenerys, and a large portion of the Khalasar gathered at the docks in a massive procession. The freed slaves cheered her name, though some great masters scowled from the shadows, looking for any chance to regain power. She had left a small garrison of loyal soldiers and a caretaker behind to maintain order in Meereen in her name. She had no wish to remain, but she would not leave a power vacuum. The loading of horses was chaotic. Dothraki warriors seethed with fear and rage, trying to calm their mounts as they were led onto ships. Many a horse kicked and screamed at the unfamiliar rocking of the deck. The air filled with whinnies and curses, but eventually, through a combination of brute force and coaxing, they managed to secure them. Food and water barrels were hauled aboard, enough for what would be a protracted journey. Daenerys carried Drogon on her arm, his wings folded tight, as she stepped onto the deck of the flagship, an imposing galley that had once belonged to a Meereenese noble. Its sails now bore a red dragon on a black field, newly painted. Rhaegal and Viserion were handled by a small retinue of attendants trained in dealing with the young beasts, though they still hissed and spat flame at anyone who ventured too close. Drogo followed, keeping his expression neutral despite the tension in his shoulders. This was a moment no true Dothraki had ever willingly embraced, riding wooden horses across cursed waters. But for Drogo, pride overcame fear. He had promised Daenerys a throne. He would not fail her now. He set foot aboard the ship, and the entire vessel seemed to hold its breath. Dothraki warriors on neighboring ships let out a chant, pounding the rails in unison. Drogo raised his arak to the sky, shouting a command. The chant spread across the harbor, a thunderous echo that set the gulls scattering from the rigging. Thus began the great crossing. Days turned into weeks upon the open water. The Dothraki fumed at the endless expanse of blue. Many warriors took to sleeping on deck, refusing to stay below in cramped quarters. Some grew seasick. Others spent their time polishing weapons, telling stories of the cities they had sacked. Daenerys spent her hours studying navigation charts with Ser Jorah, or practicing Valyrian commands for her dragons. Drogo prowled the deck, barking orders at the thralls who rowed. He trusted no one to row lazily and found any sign of sloth unacceptable, punishing it with immediate brutality. The faint rancor in the air was offset by the strong sense of purpose. They skirted the coastline of Valyria's peninsula, keeping well out at sea to avoid the smoking sea's notorious horrors. Even from a distance, the sky near Valyria was often dark, swirling with ash. Daenerys felt a shiver as she glimpsed ruins on the horizon, half shrouded in volcanic fumes. She thought of her ancestors who had come from that fabled land, dragon lords who had once commanded the known world. The fires of Valyria had birthed the Targaryens, and destroyed so many others. Eventually, they made harbor in Volantis for reprovisioning and to gather more intelligence on the state of Westeros. Whispers abounded in the docks. The Seven Kingdoms were in turmoil. King Joffrey Baratheon sat uneasily on the Iron Throne, while Robb Stark warred in the north, Stannis Baratheon claimed Dragonstone, and Renly Baratheon had made his own claim. The War of the Five Kings had begun in earnest, fracturing the realm. Daenerys and Drogo exchanged a glance of predatory satisfaction. Westeros was ripe for conquest if it was already tearing itself apart. The mere presence of a Dothraki horde in Volantis caused a stir, but the city was too large to be easily cowed, and Drogo had no intention of getting entangled in another urban fight. They bartered for supplies, made necessary repairs, and left quickly, continuing northwest. As the next stretch of the voyage wore on, the dragons began to spread their wings a bit more each day. They could not yet fly far, but Daenerys encouraged them to test the air, offering scraps of meat from the rigging. Rhaegal shrieked and glided in short bursts between the masts, while Viserion gnawed on the sails, driving sailors to distraction. Drogon, the largest and most temperamental, often snapped at the others, claiming Daenerys' shoulder as his perch alone. Drogo sometimes watched them with wary fascination, always mindful of their growing capacity for flame. Weeks later, after skirting Lys and Myr, they drew near the Stepstones, the chain of islands that dotted the sea between Essos and Dorne. Pirates prowled these waters, drawn by the shipping lanes, but the sight of so many war galleys flying Targaryen banners, not to mention the rumor of dragons on board, deterred most of them. Only once did a small fleet of raiders dare to attack, hoping for a surprise. The Dothraki responded with savage glee, boarding the pirates' vessels in a chaotic melee. The dragons, startled by the sounds of battle, unleashed small gouts of flame from the rigging. The pirates were overwhelmed by the ferocity of the horde. Several of their ships were captured or burned, leaving blackened husks drifting in the stepstones. This minor skirmish only heightened the legends being whispered about Khal Drogo and Daenerys Stormborn. Eventually, they left the stepstones behind and turned north, hugging the coast of Dorne. From the deck, Daenerys could see rugged cliffs and sandy beaches. Gulls circled overhead. The warm climate was reminiscent of Essos, though the presence of Westerosi castles perched on ridges reminded her that she was at last within sight of the land she had dreamed of reclaiming. She felt a shiver of excitement, and a measure of sorrow for Viserys, who had wanted this so desperately and never lived to see it. Landfall came at a lonely stretch of beach near the southernmost tip of Dorne, far from any heavily garrisoned castle. Under cover of night, the ships moved closer to shore, and small boats ferried men and horses onto the beach. Torches flickered along the coast, guiding the disembarkation. The Dothraki, unsteady on their feet after so long at sea, stumbled onto the sand, kissing the ground in gratitude for solid earth. Horses whinnied and pranced, delighted to feel land beneath their hooves. Daenerys, stepping ashore with Drogon perched on her shoulder, felt a surge of triumph. She was in Westeros at last. Drogo strode down the gangplank, boots sinking into wet sand. He surveyed the dark horizon, inhaling the scents of this foreign land. He turned to Daenerys, eyes shining with a fierce glint. "The stallion who mounts the world has arrived." Daenerys nodded, her heart pounding. She gazed inland, where the faint silhouettes of distant mountains rose against the moonlit sky. "And the dragon has come home," she whispered, thinking of her ancestors who once conquered these lands with fire and blood. By dawn, thousands of Dothraki warriors had assembled on the beach, reuniting with their horses, ready to ride. Daenerys and Drogo conferred with Ser Jorah about the state of the local defenses. Dorne was ruled by House Martell, historically opposed to the Iron Throne's Lannister rule. If approached carefully, they might be open to an alliance. But trust would be hard-earned. House Martell remembered the brutal fate of Princess Elia and her children at the hands of the Mountain during the sack of King's Landing. Yet Daenerys bore no love for the Lannisters either. Perhaps that common hatred could be the foundation of an alliance. However, the Dothraki did not wait politely for alliances. With the main body of the Horde reunited, they began their first raids, galloping across the Dornish hinterlands, seizing whatever they could find. Livestock, valuables, captives. Daenerys tried to restrain the worst excesses, but she knew the Dothraki's nature. Without a clear direction or immediate conquest, they defaulted to pillaging. She told Drogo they must move north, quickly, if they were to take advantage of the realm's fractured state. Drogo agreed. His blood riders spread out, collecting intelligence. They returned with word that King Joffrey's hold on the Iron Throne was tenuous, that the realm was in chaos with the War of the Five Kings. Seizing King's Landing might be possible if the city's defenses were divided or undermanned. But a direct assault on the capital, which boasted formidable walls and the might of the Lannister armies, could still be costly. Daenerys suggested forging alliances with houses discontented under Lannister rule, like the North under Robb Stark or possibly the Tyrells, who might be swayed under the right conditions. But no house would wholeheartedly welcome a horde of foreign raiders. Therefore, the best plan seemed to be a rapid strike, using the dragons to sow chaos. Drogo relished the idea. He would ride at the head of his warriors, sweeping away any resistance, while Daenerys unleashed dragonfire from above. At least once her children were strong enough to carry her. Until then, their mere presence might be enough to break enemy morale. And so it was that Khal Drogo and Daenerys Stormborn took their first steps into the tapestry of Westeros, guided by ambition and prophecy. Their combined will was as unstoppable as the tide. A new chapter of conquest began with the pounding of hooves on Dornish soil, the snapping of red-black sails in the harbor, and the shrill cries of infant dragons tasting the dawn air of a continent they had never known. Already, distant watchers hurried to dispatch ravens, carrying frantic messages to lords and ladies across the Seven Kingdoms. The dragons have returned. The Dothraki are here. Prepare for fire and blood. And as the sun rose on that fateful day, Daenerys could almost hear the winds of change whispering through the dunes. She stood beside Drogo, a hand resting on his forearm, her new brood of dragons arrayed around her, and she wondered if the realm had ever faced a storm quite like this. One forged from the fires of resurrection, guided by a queen who had walked through flames unscathed, and driven by a Khal who had conquered even death. The war horns sounded. The horses snorted, eager to run. Daenerys, heart pounding, lifted her gaze to the sky, where Drogon beat his wings in a shack. Why hover above the dunes? She felt the scorching heat of the rising sun on her face, and she smiled, for the dawn was hers to seize. She whispered, her voice carrying a quiet promise that only the wind and the flames could hear. "I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, and I will take what is mine with fire and blood." Then the Khalasar rode forth. Blood riders brandished rocks. The freedmen marched with new purpose, and the dragons shrieked their birthright to the heavens. Onward they surged, an unstoppable wave across the sun-baked Dornish sands, forging the first steps of a conquest that would reshape the world. The destiny of Khal Drogo and Daenerys Targaryen was written now in living flame, and the Seven Kingdoms would never be the same.